Good morning, everyone. Today is November 17th, 2022, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are very proud to host and moderate another one of these programs of interest to mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and anyone who negotiates. As I think everyone knows by now, one of the best parts of the program is announcing the progress that we've made, that our audiences have made in contributing money to food banks in honor of our great speakers. There's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute to a food bank if they like what they see. And it's wonderful to report every week just how much our generous audiences have contributed. Jean, do you have the number, and would you do the honors, please?
I do, and I will. Today, I'm thrilled to tell you all that so far of donations of which we have been told, the total is $332,341.85. I mean, we're almost at 350,000. That'll be the next threshold, but think of how many millions of meals that is. Well, more than 3 million meals. Well done, everyone.
Wow, that is awesome. Thank you so much to our generous audiences and to our great speakers. And we have another great speaker to add to our roster today, Hélène de Kovachich, who is one of the leading pioneers of alternative dispute resolution in Quebec and throughout Canada. After practicing in the field of tax law, in 1994, she founded Group Option Mediation. And I know that's not the right French pronunciation, but it's the best I can do, from which she practiced mediation. She works as a civil commercial mediator at the Canadian and international levels. Hélène received the title of Distinguished Fellow from the International Academy of Mediators in 2006. She has trained judges in Quebec, Canada, and abroad on judicial mediation. She's mediated over 1,000 cases in private and judicial mediation on a national and international level, variety of fields. She has spearheaded various work-related partnerings and has participated in conflict design processes for organizations, institutions, and businesses. Hélène has a long list of accomplishments which are on the website, too long for us to describe here. She's been a judge in Quebec and recently left the bench to go back into private mediation practice. Hélène, we are delighted that you are here with us to talk about judicial and private mediation as seen from Canada and internationally. Please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then we're very much looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Well, actually, the non-for-profit that I suggested is called Caviletti, which is for autistic children that are 12 years and under and their families. So it's an organization that offers free services for their families. And so every penny counts, and we give them food there and activities. And it's in the Eastern Townships with horses and goats and all sorts of things. So we're hoping that people are generous because these children feel they have normal time with their families. And we offer this to schools too, free of charge.
Fantastic. And we've posted the link in the chat, Natalie, is that right? So please take a look at that in the chat. And Hélène, we're very much looking forward to your presentation and conversation. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. First of all, I should say good morning to some of us, good afternoon to others, and good evening to others. As I understand, there's people from all around the world and different continents. And so I want to thank the organization for inviting me and mention how wonderful your organization is doing. So thank you very much for having me here and for what you're doing with all these food banks. I would like to share my experience with you about the private mediation and judicial mediation. I understand that most of the participants today already have expertise in mediation. Some of you may have already been sometimes in judicial mediation or in private mediation. But here, I think what I'd like to share is the experience of Quebec, which I understand is a bit of a fountainhead of different processes in judicial mediation. And the takeaways that I would like to leave with the participants is helping lawyers to decide with their clients whether they want to go into private mediation or they would choose a judicial mediation process. And those who are in government or officials who may want to implement an integrated judicial mediation system in the courts, what we need to know so that it works. First of all, I think the first thing we need to do is get the wording straight. In Quebec, when we talk, or in Canada, about judicial mediation, it's a process where it's integrated in the court system. So that means that it's a judge who will sometimes be assigned for a hearing, and sometimes the judge will be assigned to act as a mediator. Obviously, if he's going to be acting as a mediator in a case and the case doesn't settle, it is important to understand that the judge will never hear the case as an adjudicator. It's important to mention that that's how we see the system here in Quebec or in Canada. 2 weeks ago, I was in Paris and I was speaking with the Tribunal Administratif de Paris, which are doing wonderful innovations to integrate mediation in their court system. I understand that for them, judicial mediation at this point is mainly a judge referring the parties to go into a mediation, but with a private mediator outside of the court. So it's important to make sure that the wording, even though we say the same words, judicial mediation, it doesn't have the same meaning. It's not the same process. And it may be true for other countries. It may be true in England or in the States. And I also, in certain tribunals, here in Quebec, it's a civil law jurisdiction mainly, although we also have common law issues. It's a province in the country of Canada. And what is so special about the way we did the mediation is that we really integrated it into our system of the courts. Now, I think to get a better understanding of this is also, I understand that last week, the Minister of Justice of France was here in Quebec to share with us and understand how we developed our processes, to see how they can implement in their system, because I think it's not a one size fits all. It started, I think, in Singapore in the late 1980s, actually, judges who were doing mediation. And it was implanted in Quebec in a way that was very particular. And I think the history of how it came about is important. In Quebec, we had small claims court in 1994 who offered two parties mediation. And that meant that it was a roster list. It wasn't the judges in small claim courts that would do the mediation. And then it evolved into family mediation, got into being popular in the 1997 because the legislator imposed an information session. People started to understand what mediation was about. Lots of people get divorced, unfortunately or fortunately, but so mediation got to be known in Quebec. And so the Minister of Justice realized that it would be an answer to access to justice in certain cases. For this to happen, we had to implement the system. I was part of a small group with two judges, one of Court of Appeal, Superior Court, and I was the practitioner, and we had three scholars from the University of Sherbrooke. And so it was a group of 5 people that worked at how would we implement it so that it would be used in an appropriate way. We all know the advantages of mediation. Mediation can start, as we all know, at an early stage of the conflict, before their procedures. It can even be used as preventing conflict, as a partnering. When you go into a private mediation, you choose your mediator or mediators, because you can choose also if you want to do a co-mediation. You can choose the process. It's flexible. You build the process with the mediator and the parties. You determine the dates. You determine who the parties will be. You determine how long you will be consecrating time to do the private mediation. It can start because you choose to, in the sense that it can be in a clause, in a contract, or it can be just something ad hoc where people choose to go into it. There are many strategies, many options. There's no really time limitation. Some of the difficulties with private mediation is sometimes getting the parties to enter the process. As we all know, there's still some perception of, oh, if I propose mediation and it's not provided for in the contract or in a specific statutory law, they may think I have a bad case. Difficulty with time limitation, respecting agendas. Sometimes also you have hard clients or lawyers that are having difficult or using difficult techniques in a mediation process. And this is where also judicial mediation can be helpful. There are similarities with private mediation and judicial mediation, but there are also differences. But before we go into that, I think I would like to share with you some important elements that need to be thought of when wanting to build a judicial mediation, as we have here in Quebec. Is the first one is, why do you want to put it into the court system? It may be to create access to justice. At the Tribunal Administratif du Québec, where I was a judge, it was implemented in the statutory law in 1998, and it was to create access to justice mainly because most, or maybe half of the parties who come in front of our court are not represented. So for them, it's hard to present their case. It's easier to do a mediation. And so it's one of the aspects of the advantages of judicial mediation. One of the elements that need to be thought of when you're doing judicial mediation or you want to implement it in your court is that you must have a one process, uniformity of the process. Unlike private mediation, when you can build your process and adapt it depending on the parties and what you want to do, in judicial mediation, you have to have foreseeability. You need the judge, the lawyers and the parties to know what to expect when to go in front of a judge who will be a mediator. The basic is also the training of the judges. The judges cannot just be assigned a mediation case if they're not properly trained. They need to be trained, they need to be trained, they need to be trained. And I'm saying it 3 times. It's like location, location, location. The reason being that it is a different role when you're a mediator than when you're an adjudicator. You're not deciding for the parties. So the judges must be trained to know the difference and that they're going to be facilitators. But because of their moral authority, because they sometimes sit on the bench and make decisions, they are experts in the law. They are experts in processes. They are perceived by the parties to be impartial and neutrals. And so it gives the parties a last chance, like their day in court, even if it's a mediation and not a hearing. It's important for judges when they're doing the training, and I can testify that there is a lot of training done for judges when they're acting as mediators, and not all judges will be assigned mediation cases. And that's important because not all judges are interested in acting as mediators, and they don't have all the human skills. Sometimes you're an adjudicator and you're implementing a process and you don't really want to be a mediator. So it's important that not all the judges act as mediators also. It's important that the judges, when they're trained, realize there's an imaginary red line that they can't cross. They have, obviously, the trust of the parties. They cannot use any type of techniques. It's important for them to know that they can't always do caucuses. I would recommend strongly not to do caucuses as a judge if a party is not represented, because you're going to be alone in a room with a citizen and he may or she may not understand, or you may not convene your ideas properly. So it's a tricky situation. So judicial mediation is really not a private mediation. And it's there to create another tool for the parties to have assistance from the court. But it's not there to replace the private mediation.
Hélène, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I assume that you're thinking that a judge ought not to be alone with an unrepresented party, is that whatever the judge says might be taken in a coercive kind of way, right? And kind of overwhelming the free decision-making of the party. So a judge always has a certain amount of authority. A judge who's part of the court system in any country has a great degree of authority and respect. What are things that judges can and should do in mediations so that they do not appear to be coercive, and indeed things that any mediator ought to do so that we can share our opinions in constructive ways if we think it's constructive, but not coercive? What are some of the
It's a very interesting, it's a very important question that you asked, because obviously setting the table at the beginning of the session is important. And just before that, in an integrated system as we have in Quebec, there's a form that is sent to the parties that they will sign to confirm that they wish to go into mediation. So it's a different rule than the hearing. Usually our rooms, when there's no COVID, it's a round table, and we've done mediation online during COVID, which makes it very comfortable for the parties. They're at home. There's a great access to justice in that means. So the basic first contact is the most important one, I would say, where the judge explains his role, explains that even though he's a judge, he will not be making a decision. He will not be influencing. He cannot give opinions. He will transmit information. He will ask parties to share information. But it's very important. I think that first part of the process is the most important one. And then afterwards is making sure that in his nonverbal and his or her wording, she always or he stays neutral. And there are techniques that you can use where you want to share ideas, and but you can't and you should not give opinions. Because if it's one person's opinion, it could be different on the bench, because you don't have the same type of proof that you would have in a forum of a hearing. So that's why I say the techniques are different. And one of the things that at the tribunal we do is, I mean, if we have a limited time to do the judicial mediation, usually in the social affairs cases, we'll give an hour and 15 minutes to the parties, which is not a lot of time. So the lawyers have to be trained appropriately. They have to know what to expect. And this is why the uniformity of the process from one judge mediator to another is important. It's important that the judge specifies that they have an hour and 15 minutes. It's important that the lawyers who come with their clients know that, and they prepare their clients ahead of time so that the clients don't feel that they're being pushed around or bousculés. it's very important for lawyers to know how to prepare their clients in a private mediation versus a judicial mediation, because they are two different systems. The judicial mediation is in an institution, so it has to be with certain rules. It's not a free mediation just to say you have a free mediation. And in the Civil Code of Procedure now in Quebec, there is provision that suggests that parties consider amicable means of resolving conflicts before they file a case in front of the court. So there's an argument to be made that the lawyers should go through negotiation and mediation before filing. And when you're implementing a judicial mediation process, it should be thought of that maybe not all cases could go into mediation. At the Tribunal Administratif du Québec, we, the judges, identify a series of types of cases that we can hear. So not all cases are favorable for mediation. In civil and commercial, it's a bit different. It's in the civil and commercial cases, if the parties wish, they have a form and they can file to ask the court for a judicial mediation. But they will not choose the date. They will not choose the mediator, the judge, and they have a limited time period to do so. So there are more advantages in doing a private mediation than a judicial mediation. However, it is important to give that occasion of access to justice in a court of law where now we are used to doing mediation. And that's really what it's all about. And making sure that when the system is implemented, it's not to the detriment of private mediation, but it's to give a tool. In Quebec, at the beginning, it was supposed to be for hearings of 3 days and more to do judicial mediation. But it got very popular, and lots of judges or lawyers, I should say, with difficult clients or with a difficult adversary would prefer going into judicial mediation than doing the private mediation. Or they did try the private mediation and it didn't work. So they file into court. But we understand that because there's procedure filed in the court, the confidentiality aspect of mediation is a little bit tinted. Whereas if you do a private mediation, you can be sure that the publicity of a case is not heard. Another reason why you may want to go into judicial mediation is if there's public pressure. Maybe I can share a story about when I was a judge and I was doing expropriation law. I heard a case, and I will share with you the story. It's this young entrepreneur in construction with his wife and children choose to leave the city and to go and live in the countryside. And he decides to do a development. And he saw a beautiful, beautiful piece of land that's located on 2 municipalities. Now, as you all know, municipalities need to have solutions from the council. They can't just do things individually, the mayors. So there's a public aspect here. So what happened is that he bought a piece of land that citizens in those 2 municipalities for the last 5-10 years were used to using to either, it's in Quebec, so they would cross-country ski or do snowshoeing. In the winter, they would use their bicycles. In the summer, go walk their dogs, whatever. And there was for sale signs by the owners who weren't using the land. And when this entrepreneur bought the land and he started closing off the access because he wanted to do his project, the citizens got involved and there was social pressure. So it was expropriated to the benefits of citizens to use it as a park. And in front of the Tribunal Administratif, we had the jurisdiction to hear this case to determine its value, the value in counterpart of the expropriation. So we had about 20 people around the table, experts, we had the mayors of the two municipalities, we had the lawyers of the municipalities and of the contractor. And one of the things that we can do as a judge, the only thing I can do as a judge in that type of case is give, at the end of the day, a bottom line figure, is say, this is how much this person should have gotten as much money for the counterpart of being expropriated on his land. Now, in a mediation case, things went a bit differently. What was interesting is that, as you all know, we make the pie bigger. In a court of law, he's not going to start saying, my kids, as a testimony, my kids don't want to go to school anymore. Why don't your kids want to go to school anymore? Because in the court, in the schoolyard, the kids are teasing him and bullying them because they're seen as the kids of the city guy who wanted to, take away the land from the people. And this man wanted to stay and have integrated community life in the country. And when in the case of the mediation, we asked him, I said, if you have a magic wand, what would you like to do? What would you do? Do you want to leave? Go back to the city? Do you want to stay? He says, no, I want to stay. I want to contribute to this community. This is what my wife and I want to do. And so one of the things that was interesting is that during the conversation, the mayor was saying, well, if I had a magic wand and lots of money, we'd like to have a place where the youth after school could gather. And we need to build it, but we don't have the resources. So I'm sure that some of you already have little ideas, twinklets of solutions. So obviously the mediation process created a new project for the municipality and this contractor who got involved in a new project. And they were able, with this in mind, to come to terms and agree on an amount of money. Never in a judicial court, as a judge in a hearing, could I have helped these people that way, because the word help is what it's all about. When people come to see a mediator, is to get help to solve the conflict. When they go to court, it's because they couldn't do it themselves, so they need help. And a judicial mediation is like a little buoy before going to court. It's one last chance, or it's because we couldn't do it differently. So it's a tool that's open and it's interesting, but it shouldn't be used, again, I say it, instead of private mediation, because it's using the government's money in the wrong place, because it's not supposed to be that. The court is supposed to be when you can't agree. And having been 16 years in a court writing decision, I have to say that it's so much better in agreement. And I know that some of you are judges or mediators, and I know that you know that it's always better to have an agreement, settlement than a decision, for all the reasons that we know. So it's important also to know that some of the pros is that if you're wanting to implement judicial process in your court, you have to think, what are your resources? Do you want to do it with the judges? If so, they need to be trained. If so, what type of cases you are willing to hear, or opening it for one-day court or many. In the case that I explained to you, in the expropriation case, we had 4 weeks of hearing scheduled because of all the expertise and blah, blah. And it took 4 days over a period of 2 weeks. So it makes a big difference for the parties. And for the lawyers, they were ecstatic. They were really happy because their clients know that they can do really well for them. So the lawyers were happy because it's more business. Their clients are happy. They didn't have to be for 4 weeks in court with all the emotional struggles that brings forth. So doing the mediation was an asset in this case. So these are different examples of situations. Also, judicial mediation sometimes is used. It's interesting. I've seen in the courts, in the cases that I have had, some parties who were given information, because as we know, in a mediation, there's always new information that seems to pop into the conversation, and which is wonderful. And based on that information, some parties decide to just let go of the procedure. So that's another interesting twist, is that it's informative and people realize that they don't have the case they thought they did, and they decide to let go of their case. Sometimes they settle in a way that they didn't think they would. And it doesn't mean that it's not a good settlement, because when you're a judge, you know what the case law is. So there's, like, I call it in French, a carré de sable. It's like a sandbox of possibilities. And you build your settlement with the knowledge of all these possibilities. One of the things that makes it interesting for lawyers to go into private mediation is that they can, with their clients, choose their mediators. In judicial mediation, they can't. However, in judicial mediation, you have the judge's legal or moral authority because he's a fiduciary of the law in many cases. So it's really a balance of what the strategy the lawyer wants to use. But I would argue that it's always better to start with private mediation than going to court. But it would be interesting to have the possibility for parties to benefit from judicial mediation if they chose to. So I don't know if there would be other questions at this point that you may want to ask.
So, Ellen, I have a question. In your role when you were a judge, you talked about not being coercive and being careful about using the authority of the robe, so to speak, to force people to do things. At the same time, when you're a judge, you're working for the government. You're getting paid by the court system. And it seems to me the court system has an interest in getting cases settled, getting the docket cleared up so that the judges who have to adjudicate cases will have more time, be able to pay more attention and more detail to the cases that really do need an adjudication. So how, as a judge, when you were a judge, how did you balance the need of your client, the court system, to have cases cleared out versus the role of the mediator in and not abusing that power and not being coercive? How did that play out in your mind?
It's important that you ask this question. I thank you, because when you are asked and trained to do mediation, one of the main aspects is not to force a settlement, as you mentioned, and there is never any pressure, and I can testify to that, about having to settle a case. If it doesn't settle, it just goes onto a hearing with another colleague who's going to be hearing it as an adjudicator. I have to say that that is a very important point. There's no arm twisting, and there's no success stories. I mean, we are very quiet about the cases because we can't talk about them to our colleagues, because we don't know if our colleagues, if the case doesn't settle, will be hearing it or not. So it's a very confidential system. And at the TAC, we know that the case has been through mediation because it's on the primitif. However, we don't know who is going to get the case. And there is never any pressure, nor by the president or the chair, nor by the colleagues. And I have to say that because there is no pressure, The judges, they enjoy doing the mediation. They don't feel they have to score, as we say, having settlements all the time, because for us, a success is not necessarily a settlement. It means that either the parties are satisfied with the process, even though they didn't get a hearing, because they had their day in court. They might choose to go further into a hearing or not. If they choose to go into a hearing, they will have another judge on the bench, so they know that there's confidentiality. So there's really no arm twisting, and that is very important when you put the process together.
Okay. And then, Hélène, in terms of the feedback that mediators give, particularly to unrepresented parties, and there's a question along these lines in the chat. You mentioned the holding back, withholding of opinions and feedback because of concern that it would appear as coercive. The question I've always had about that is, aren't we giving a value to feedback, whether we know it or not, in subconscious ways? Everything from our facial expressions, sometimes inadvertently, we'll raise an eyebrow when somebody says something, indicating, really? You really expect me to believe that? Our tone of voice, the kinds of questions that we choose to ask and not ask. What safeguards do you build in to protect against coercion or to protect against inappropriate evaluative feedback that might be unconscious or subconscious?
It's a good question also. I think it's in the preparation of the case. When I'm going to be hearing a case as a judge, I will be preparing my notes and looking for certain elements to know what type of proof I'm looking for. What do I need to hear to determine one way or another? So I know how I'm preparing the case is to make a decision later on. When I am given the assignment to be a mediator in a case, I prepare it totally differently. And even I have a form that I make myself, knowing who the parties are, what their age are, what their situation is, trying to understand who's in front of me and what is the question in litigation, of course, but not looking so much as the law like I would for a hearing. I'm trying to see how I can help them by asking questions, getting more information out. What is the source of the misinformation? Is it lack of understanding? Is lack of documents? So it's in the preparation that it starts.
Mm-hmm.
And once I have done the preparation in a totally different way, my attitude in the mediation process will naturally, I think, flow. And knowing that I will have that reserve of not giving my opinion. But however, I have to say that we, knowing the case law, we might ask questions when we hear it, not when I'm preparing, but when I'm hearing different elements, I may say, have you asked yourself these questions? Have you looked into that? So parties will be able to look into it together. But it's not something that I will force. It is only based on what I hear during the mediation. But I think that those foreguard is in the preparation.
And what do you do, Hélène, as a judicial mediator, when you sense that one side is just wrong? You know, this claim there's no way this claim is going to succeed, or the chances are so minuscule, or someone has a defense that just doesn't make sense, and the odds are just overwhelming that the person is going to get clobbered if they actually go to an adjudication. What are the appropriate limits or tools for a judge to use in a mediation when particularly an unrepresented party is just obviously missing the boat?
First of all, my role as a judge mediator is not to convince them that they have a case or not. It's to help them to discuss. So the first thing is the other side, who usually has a lawyer, it's rare that they don't have lawyers on each side, will give information, and they will share their perspective on what the case should be or could be. And we do give time limits to the process. So obviously, after a certain time, I will delimit. I mean, in social affairs, we have 1 hour and 15 minutes. So if the case is not settled within the 60 minutes, I will give the parties the chance to say, okay, well, there's no settlement to be seen here. Would you like to withdraw your case, or would you like to go further and have a hearing date? It's as simple as that.
Okay. And there's a question about, is judicial mediation limited due to the fact that a judge may not caucus with unrepresented clients? So are you basically keeping people together for the whole hour and 15 minutes or however long the mediation lasts?
It's yes. The answer is, if there's not a lawyer on each side, I will only do joint sessions. I do not feel comfortable. I think it can be tricky because of moral authority, and it can be seen as a biased way of trying to convince somebody. And because the caucuses are confidential, my neutrality or impartiality could be questioned. So I would really suggest not to do caucuses. So in that way, there are limited use of techniques and strategies that you don't see that in private mediation. In private mediation, you have a larger toolbox than in judicial mediation because we are judges.
And many times you get parties who just don't like each other, right? They're angry and upset at each other. And there you are, you have to keep them together in a room for the entire length of the mediation. And they probably don't want to look at each other, much less talk to each other. How do you keep the conversation going when you sense that elevated animosity between people?
Because we're in a tribunal, parties have a different attitude than if you're in a private mediation. I've noticed that because I did private mediation maybe for 12, 13 years before being a judge. And they're maybe more natural when they're in a private mediation, whereas when they come in front of a judge, they will restrain from aggressivity. They will state how they think. They will state if they're not happy and how they feel, but we don't hear people screaming. We don't hear violence, and they accept sitting in the same room because that's the process. If you want to go into judicial mediation, you have to accept that it's a constraint. It's not like a private mediation.
So people who sign up for it know what they're getting into.
They should, and that's where the lawyer needs to prepare. If you go on the sites of the tribunals, like the Tribunal Administratif du Québec, where I was, we have little capsules of information so that parties who are not represented, or if they are, they have point form of things they should think of before entering the mediation to prepare for it. There's videos and there's tools. And so that helps people to prepare.
And when you're dealing with lawyers and their clients, there are many conversations about the one role of the mediator as being to help lawyers break bad news to their own clients and get their own clients' perhaps unrealistic or emotionally charged views of the case into more of a zone of reality. Can you comment on how that works in the processes in which you've operated, both in the private system and in the court system?
Like you, Jeff, I've seen this happening, and I don't know if we do break the bad news in saying there's no case or there's a case, but I think it's in a caucus. In a caucus, I would question and orient the questions to say, well, what are the elements of proof? What is the strong elements of your case? What are the weak points? And sometimes you can work with the parties in a caucus, asking them, well, what you think would be an appropriate agreement that the other party would like to agree with. Not something that you want, but the other one would agree to also. And as a judge, you can ask questions. What are the strong points of your case? What are the weak points in your case? You don't tell them, but you ask them. So I think that in that respect, it's a bit the same techniques, private or judicial. You will ask questions in a caucus. If you can't, because one of the parties is not represented, then you have a limited toolbox. And that's part of what judicial mediation is also, and is not. And that's why I strongly recommend to do private mediation before entering judicial mediation. Judicial mediation is like one more last chance before you go to court. It's not instead of private mediation.
Okay, there's a question in the Quebec judicial mediation system. Is mediation a choice offered to the parties, or is it ordered by the court? Mediation is a voluntary process, part of the parties' self-determination. In some United States courts, mediation is ordered rather than being offered as a choice the parties may accept or reject. And the questioner, Mr. Philip Emmons, says that's antithetical to the concept of self-determination. So could you clarify, in Quebec, it's people opt into it?
It's interesting. It depends on the courts and it depends in the cases. At the Quebec Tribunal, Administrative Tribunal, where I sat as a judge, there's a provision in the statutory law that states that the president, the vice president, or a judge may force parties in certain instances. It doesn't mean they force an agreement, but in certain instances, we know, or no, it's been deemed, or it's offered that the knowledge of the court is that this case should go to mediation. And sometimes it will be forced to go to it. Doesn't mean you have to stay more than an hour or half an hour, but you should try to do it. And in the Quebec Provincial Court, Superior Court, and Appeal Court, I don't believe it's mandatory. I think it's an opt-in. So is at the tribunal, because we have forms that we send. We invite people to come to the mediation, but they choose to or not. So it's an opt-in, except for certain cases.
Okay, let's open it up. We have about 10 or so minutes left. If other people have questions, please post them in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself and just ask, you're certainly welcome to do that as well.
Because I see that there's some people that have experience in judicial mediation, and they might want to share experiences and the strengths or weaknesses that they have in their countries, because there's different programs.
Yes, I can say something.
Please.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Sir Dan.
Nice to have you here, Sir Dan.
Yes.
So I have a big experience in judicial and outside of court mediation. So, you know, there is a kind of narrow perception of the role of the judge within the court. So everybody sees judges like some strict, formal people with a lot of power. And they are just humans. And if we can change a hat for a mediator hat, we are not anymore judges, no more what people think about us. And because of that, as Ellen said, it's not appropriate that all judges can mediate, but only those who are able to do it who believe in mediation. So I heard a lot of time that judges, mediators are abnormal mediators, but they are not, you know. There is not a difference. Then this mediation is happening inside of the court. And there is one strong precondition to mediate at the court is to have a file at the court, you know. You cannot mediate at the court if you don't have a case at the court. And the mediation is really kind of last chance for the parties. And I always tell them, this is a chance for you to take back control over your life, over your destiny, over your case. This is your life, it's not my life. So if my colleagues will decide about you, I promise you that you will be not happy. And very recently, I met a judge from Poland. He visited Croatia and Zagreb, and he's very nice in doing things in courtroom to help parties to settle. And he told me, I feel that I am not successful in the case when I have to decide in it. Can you imagine that? So the only role of the judge is not just to decide by the law. It is the first to help people, to inform them there are another possibilities, and maybe to step out a bit out of his or her role and really help them. And there is no better way of helping them than mediation. Thank you very much.
So, Serdan, let me ask you a question.
Yes, please.
Is it, although the judge may think of him or herself as stepping into a different role, and Hélène, I'd be interested in your views as well. What about the participants? They look at the judge, and we train people in societies to look at judges as people with authority who deserve respect, who deserve deference. What can a judge or someone in an authority position do to try to get people to change their perception and perhaps relate to the authority figure differently than they're accustomed to doing?
Yes, very good question, Jeff. So we do everything what mediators really do. So I tell them, please do not see judge in me. I am waiting them in front of the door. I'm saying hello, I shake their hands. I'm talking with them about the weather, about their travel. And I talk with them not in a formal way, but in a plain English or Croatian, and make them feel accepted, recognized, respected. And I tell them, this is your life, this is your problem, and I'm really here to try to help you. Let's put aside the law and the role of the court aside, and let's talk about what really happened among you, between you, and what you really want from this case. Yes.
And Serdan, are you operating under the same kind of time constraint as Hélène?
Me not.
Yes.
If we need more time, I give them more time.
It's interesting what Serdan says.
Yes.
When you greet the parties, it's the most important thing for them to feel comfortable. And in a Zoom, it's harder. When we're not in Zooms, I do the same as Serdan. We shake their hands and we go and greet them in the waiting room. And it's a totally different atmosphere than if you're sitting on the bench in a different type of room where you're on a bench up high and they're far behind. But in a Zoom, what's interesting is you only have words, but you see the people in a closer environment because they have their iPhone close to their face. And so what I've noticed is when I tell them, and then again, I said that the introduction is the most important thing, because you tell them, you know what, you're in the front of a judge, but we're acting as mediators. We're not going to be deciding. And you don't have to come to an agreement today. And we're going to take the time to explain things to you. And we're doing one step at a time. And just by doing that, you sometimes see their shoulders going like that. It's almost like yoga. It's they start breathing easier, and they give a different type of attitude towards the process.
I agree, Helen, and I think, and all of we know that the most powerful tools from mediators are what they bring with themselves in the room, you know, your attitude, your smile, your presence, your respect. And I experienced two very or more nice expressions, like at the end of successful mediation, they told me, Judge Shimatz, they call me judge, not a mediator. You shouldn't be a judge, you should be a priest. Or something like, mediation in this court gained back me a faith in judiciary I didn't have before. Or something like, at the end of mediation, when you have entered in the room, we knew that we are going to settle. So this is something what we need to offer them to feel safe, even inside of the court.
Richard Lutringer asks, when you mediate as judges, do you wear your judicial robes? Do you do the session in your chambers? How does that all work?
That's a very good question. In Quebec, the judges don't wear the robes in the provincial court or the superior court, nor the Court of Appeal. And they don't do it in their chambers, but they have mediation rooms that were developed specifically for those sessions. So it's round tables. Everybody sits around the table, the judge too. They're not apart from the parties. At the tribunal, we don't sit on the bench with robes, so we don't have robes, but we do the mediation sessions in a different floor than the hearings, and it's in a different room. So right away, people, and there's no recording, the room is set up such differently that they know that it's not a hearing. And so I don't know, Sardan, in your tribunal, if that's the same.
Yes, we do the same. We have a special room for mediation. It's totally different than the courtroom, like usual mediation room, and we do not use the robes. Yes.
Okay, well, we are about at the top of the hour. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all so much. Hélène de Kovachich, we appreciate your being with us from Canada. Sardan, we appreciate your being with us from Europe and contributing another dimension to our international perspective here at the Will Work for Food Project and the New Possibilities Hour. We have the preferred food bank. Natalie, if you could pop the link into the chat. Once again, it's at the top, but if you could pop it in here again at the bottom so people can contribute and help with the situation in Canada, that would be wonderful. It's been a very successful hour. We are complete. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's nice to see you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.